Okay. A little more interesting stuff. I'm going to hop back. Well, maybe not more interesting. Interesting in a different way. This is my projector test. I like to take, oh, wrong one. Wrong button. Go back to the bottom. I like to use this to see just how good the lamp in the projector is in a presentation space. We're going to find out. That's actually pretty good. I got to tell you, that's not bad. This is also disappointing when I find a good projector because this works a lot better if the content on the slide is actually completely invisible. What I have is an example of really poor color contrast. This is really light gray text on a white background. The sentence reads, "The quick brown fox jumps over the lazy dog." Has anyone seen something kind of like this online, say filling out a form in the last 2 years? It's when you have the label for the field in the field, right? And it's really light gray. It doesn't work. From accessibility standards in most browsers, that contrast is not high enough. When I talk about contrast, I'm talking about the difference in color between the text and the background behind it. And there's actually a ratio that you have to hit. There's a standards-defined ratio of contrast. And it's in some of the W3C stuff that is linked in the slide deck. To make this an improvement, I just switched to the darker blue. And now magically everybody, well not everybody, but magically this is much easier to read. How did that print? The gray. It printed better? For your yeah. So color contrast, I do a lot of assessment work. Oh, he said that it actually printed out really well. So when I do web accessibility assessments, whether it's PDF, PowerPoint, native web pages, color contrast issues are one of the most popular. It's one of the most common things that I see and that I fail sites for and pages for. People will put text over gradients, so where the color changes a little bit in the background, and the contrast changes as well. I work at Oklahoma State University. Like I said at the top, OSU is where AbleTech lives. We are, and this is like restricted or trademarked or something, we're America's brightest orange. The orange in OSU, it's part of the marketing for the university. Well, America's brightest orange doesn't contrast with any light colors. And the web design group at OSU has put a lot of work into dealing with that fact. Like we're not going to get rid of America's brightest orange on the sites because that's the tagline. But they do have a constraint because that orange only contrasts with dark colors. So color contrast, something to account for. There are tools that you can test contrast directly. In fact, if you're on Office 365, the installed version has a color contrast checker as part of the accessibility checking system. So it'll go in and it'll grab the foreground color, it'll grab the background color, it'll dump those into a big old long math equation and spit out a ratio. For those of you who are just on the edge of your seat wondering, the ratio that you're looking for is 4.5 to 1, which is meaningless on its own because that, again, comes out of this really long math equation. But there are other tools as well that you can use to test that in your Word documents, your PDF files, on the web. There are all kinds of color contrast checkers. And they're in some of the resource links that I've given you. I'm talking about it so long because I see so much poor color contrast online. It is really, really common. I see a lot of bad color contrast unintentionally in PowerPoint slides at conferences. And there's a part of me that just feels like, why put the slides together? Because it's not trivial, right? I mean, my slides are pretty plain. It still takes time to put the stuff together. I don't want to work against myself in trying to get the message across. So, mind color contrast. And again, you can find the tools to test for it. Don't at all say, please, that this dude Rob from Oklahoma said we can only use black and white, because that's not what I'm saying at all. You can use some unique color combinations and still hit color contrast ratio. Just think about it. If you have to lean in and squint and you have pretty good vision, you're probably going to fall below color contrast. If your vision doesn't pick up contrast very well, there are tools that will, again, quantify it and let you know. Good to go, according to standards. I'll stop harping on color contrast. I might come back to it. It's a big pet peeve because it just seems like such a literally overlooked thing in many ways. So this is a 3-line line graph. Series 1 is a blue line. Series 2 is a red line. Series 3 is a green line. What's wrong with this picture? Yes, you can just shout out. I'll repeat. Blue and green are very close. What else? Green kind of fades in too easily, hard to distinguish. Red-green colorblind, completely indistinguishable from one another. Are your slides printed out in black and white? Ooh, upscale, spared no expense. Thank you, Lisa. Man. It's kind of awkward because they're almost always printed out in black and white. I don't know what to say now. When someone prints this out in black and white, they get this. They get grayscale lines that are almost completely indistinguishable from one another, which is also how people will see it if they can't distinguish the colors from one another. So the key thing using color to convey any meaning, whether it's in charts or graphs or text, is you need something in addition to color. Another please don't go home and say Rob said moment. I didn't say don't use color. For a lot of your audience, color is incredibly helpful. Data visualization, whether it's simple like a line graph or really complex stacked bar charts with all kinds of stuff, color is really, really helpful for a lot of people. You just need to use something in addition to color. So my example, you already have the slides in front of you, so I can't really ask anything surprising. In my example, I just add markers to each line. So now the blue line is still blue, but there are also triangles along it. Red line is also red, but there are diamond shapes. Green line, still green, but now just squares. So if it prints out in grayscale, or if someone can't perceive the difference in color, they can still tell which line is which. Same with text. You used to see a label for required fields, where they would say required fields will be red or whatever color, and that was it. Well, if someone can't perceive what's red and what's not, that's useless information. So now you'll see an asterisk, or you'll see literally just the word required in parentheses.
This is just
asking
your opinions on this. Would you say it would be, it would count as accessible if there was a button somewhere on the page that said colorblind mode that changed it?
No.
Okay.
It wouldn't. Same interaction, same, okay. Right? In my view, it is not. Now, some software vendors do have, I've literally seen like accessibility mode where you switch it on. And then magically some of the stuff works. The tricky part with that is that much of the time, as you can imagine, the main product keeps changing, and the accessibility product that people get sent to doesn't change in real time. So people end up with a different experience completely. So now, if you're looking for a legal answer, like I said, I'm not a lawyer. Lawyers may say, oh, sure, that's okay. I think as a matter of practice, that doesn't make any sense to have a separate but equal site. Yes?
Would a better way to develop the slides then be to use 3 bars that are either polka dotted, slashed, and then filled in?
It's another way. I think it's pretty equivalent. You're changing the format, but what you described is still the key point, where you're using an obvious visual indicator. In that case, it sounds like it would be instead of color, which is perfectly fine. But you could still have a blue bar, a red bar, and a green bar, as long as there were those distinguishing visible, different slashes or patterns that gave you that extra cue to tell which is which. Other questions? This is something you can do really easily in Excel. If you insert a chart or a graph into a Word doc, you can do this. Anyone think of another way to visibly distinguish these from one another in addition to color? So if I don't use the markers, what else could I do? Yes, you can just shout it out. These will be short. Dashes, right. Different patterns on the lines you'll see as well. There might be a solid line, a line with really wide dashes, a line with narrow dashes. There are all kinds of ways to do this. The important thing is that you're doing it. You're using color and something else. Where are we on time? And then when Google started eavesdropping, got paranoid. I want to talk a bit about multimedia. In terms of Word, those were my tips for the day. There's more to it, which is why you have the resource links in the slides to go and find out more about different techniques. Are there any kinds of stuff that you all put into Word documents that I did not get to? Oh, I know one, visuals. I skipped over something. So a screen reader, as smart as it is, at this point at least, none of the like VoiceOver, NVDA, JAWS, none of them try to describe an image. But Office 365 does. Facebook, I believe, does. The way that they do it, though, is what's important. So if I have an image, which I do, let's say that my image is what's on screen now, which this is a scissortail flycatcher. Anybody know a piece of Oklahoma-related trivia about the scissortail flycatcher? I kind of almost gave it away. Yes? I'm sorry? They do eat flies. In the summer, this time of year, they eat mosquitoes, so we love them. It's the state bird of Oklahoma. There's your random piece of knowledge. Beyond my word trick that I did earlier, there's your other completely unrelated bit of knowledge. The scissortail flycatcher is the state bird of Oklahoma. This is a picture of said bird flying up to some reeds at the side of a lake. If Microsoft or Facebook describes this image, what it's going to come up with is something very similar to what I just said. It might not be able to tell you what kind of bird it is, but it might be very, very descriptive. What do you think? I mean, is that really a text equivalent for someone who can't see it? Is a description always going to work? How many? I'm not going to. It won't. Not all the time. Because, say, for example, I'm writing an article about Oklahoma, and I have a picture of the bird, and the important thing is that it's the state bird of Oklahoma. A description may not really matter that much in that context. If I'm writing something for bird watchers, then a description of the bird and its tail feathers may be important. The tail feathers kind of look like scissors. That's where it gets its name. And it's basically the same reason that male peacocks have big tail feathers. That's the reason the scissortail has big. Somebody in a talk told me that once. I've asked that question for years. Can anybody actually tell me why it has the scissory tail? I thought it was to make it a better hunter and to make it quicker chasing mosquitoes. No, no, no. Same reason male peacocks have big, fancy tails. So your text equivalent is almost always going to be contextual and may not be a description. For those of you who are using Office 365 or Facebook, go in and edit that stuff. Think about what the software comes up with and double check it and be sure that that description is actually the equivalent. A text equivalent for a visual really should convey the intended meaning. Now, I'm not saying it won't be a description. It's context, always, always in context. It could just be a description. But, for example, if you have a picture of a couple of people standing next to each other smiling, Office is going to provide that as its first crack at alternative text. Well, it may be a lot more important to know who those people are by name. So your text equivalents need to be contextual. One of the places where they're almost always the same, though, is in logos. Oklahoma Able Tech logo, alternative text is almost always Oklahoma Able Tech, right? Logos, things like that, you don't see the same kind of variation. But remember, as some of the technology starts to advertise that it creates text equivalents, or the phrasing you'll see is alternative text, be careful, right? Because it may not really work. So the key question is, what meaning does this thing convey? Another way to think about it is, if I'm describing this to somebody on the telephone, what would I put in place of that image? Alternative text is a very specific piece of information that screen readers look for to announce or to broadcast to a Braille display, so that somebody reading the document with that technology hears whatever the alternative text is. Alternative text, again, it's a very specific little piece of content. I'm going to go back into my document and we'll find a perfectly charming picture. Maybe I got a picture of my kids or my dog or something. I actually don't think I do on here. I got a picture of a stuffed monkey with a Curious George Band-Aid on its forehead. There's a longer story here than it's worth telling. So my alternative text for this could be just about anything. The image is not really the issue. I just want to show you the mechanics of adding this alternative text. And this is the same in PowerPoint, which is another place that's really important to do this. This is one place where Office 2010 looks very different than 2013. And now if you're on 365, it looks even different still, just to make it more interesting. So if you're on 2013, 2016, or 2010, you still start in the same place, which is to select the image and right-click or do Shift F10. There's an option that will say something akin to Format Picture, which I'm going to select. And on the right-hand side in 2013 and 2016, I get this little submenu. And I'm looking for Layout and Properties, which is a little box with grids to the top and to the left of it. I dig down into this and I see a drop-down that says Alt Text, which is short for Alternative Text, because ultimately that's really what I'm digging for. Now, hilariously enough, they give me two options in this version of Office. There's a title and there's a description. For the actual alternative text, type it into the description field. If you're on 365, title is gone. You don't have to worry about it. So it makes it a little bit easier for you. But I'm going to type whatever, I'm going to type monkey boo boo in here because there's really no meaningful alt text. I'm going to type that into the description field. Now, in the Word version, when a screen reader hits it, it's going to look for whatever is in that description field, and it's going to announce the text that I put in there. The title field is where I type text. We'll see if this works. That I want to appear when somebody runs a mouse pointer over it. And of course, it's not going to work because that's the day. But the title doesn't move over. Well, number one, the title isn't typically read by screen readers, except as a fallback. And number two, it's not going to be the alternative text if you convert this to PDF. So look for that alternative text to type in. And again, you'll have to look through the Microsoft documentation with your version. And I see a couple of Macs. If you're using Office for Mac, then that same documentation set should tell you where you can go to get to this. Really, really important. Otherwise, this image doesn't exist in a meaningful way to somebody. We talked a little bit about OCR, I think, through the morning and in the last part of or in the first part of the afternoon. OCRing a file does not give you an accessible file because of things just like this. If you OCR, it converts the text that's basically a flat bit of visual stuff into actual text, but it doesn't provide alternative text for images. So there's a big difference there. There's also a big difference with things like those section headings and lists. It just gives you text. So to make it accessible, there's another step, which is adding things like the alternative text. Question in the back?
Yep.
So this is a problem that I've run into only a few times, but with our system or either Outlook in general, when sending emails, it has like restrictions on size. And so I've had to convert Word files into PDF, which I've had blind users say that they can read it, but they lose the format as you would expect. Is there ways of getting around that where you can keep it as a Word file but kind of reduce the amount of size of it? Because I feel like it's the pictures and stuff that add that size to it. Do you know of any tricks?
You might be stunned at how much extra stuff there is jammed into a PDF, but you may be right that it's the images. How do you create the PDF from Word? What steps do you take?
Basically, we just say save as PDF.
Okay.
And it generally shrinks it down to a size that we can send via email.
Okay. So help me understand then where you're running into the large file.
So it's when we try to send it through Outlook, Outlook sends us an error and saying file is too big.
It's too big. When you do the save as PDF, it's too large of a file.
It's fine, yeah. It's fine as a PDF, but not as a Word file.
So are you sending this inside your agency?
No,
Other
I'm talking
folks?
about, like, let's say I'm sending it to a consumer who's blind or
Okay.
something like that.
One thing I might suggest you do is ask them what issues are they having with it
Okay.
specifically. Is it a matter of the accessibility is not as good? Because PDF has a kind of an unfortunately, I think, undeserved reputation for not being accessible when the majority of PDFs are not accessible, but it's not PDF's fault. Does that make sense?
Right.
So if it is an accessibility issue, then that's one thing versus a file format preference issue. I'd dig in a little bit more and find out what they're running into and just ask
Okay.
them, how is this not working?
Okay.
When it comes to things like images in your Word file, there are open source and free pieces of software that will compress those down.
Okay.
Because when you insert them into Word and resize them, it doesn't change the file size itself.
Okay.
It just makes it visibly smaller.
Okay.
So I would suggest, I can't suggest any off the top of my head, but there are a bunch of them
Okay.
that will let you basically resize it completely, and it'll take away some of the file size as well.
So, like, maybe some of the standard image editors like Adobe Photoshop or...
Yeah, and there are free ones. Honestly, you might even see what Paint does. I don't know if Paint will let you resize and pare down the file size, but I would start with something like that, super basic,
Sure.
and then look and see what else may do the job. But
Okay.
it's entirely possible the images are, they're tanking your Word files, and there are tons of tools that'll let you do more than just visibly make them
Okay.
smaller.
Thank you.
Sure. So I want to talk a little bit to questions on alternative text and text equivalents. You need a text equivalent for anything visible. Those charts and graphs, if you're just publishing them in Word, you need to have a text equivalent somewhere that says, here's what this thing shows. For really complex images or complex charts or graphs, that alt text field is probably not going to be enough. If you find yourself typing a paragraph, it's entirely possible that somebody will have a version of JAWS that literally can't read everything that's in that description field. So if you have really complex stuff, my suggestion is always to just type up a longer description and just put it adjacent to the picture. There's a universal design component there where some people will benefit quite a bit from having that narrative description right there visibly as well. But I think for about 80 to 85% of the content that we use, that alternative text is going to work just fine. If you really want to dig into alternative text writing, look for the Diagram Center, DIAGRAM. If you just type diagram alt text in your search engine of choice, you'll get right to them, and they have a ton of guidance, especially on writing alt text or text equivalents for complex images. So we've done all this work in Word. We're feeling pretty good about ourselves. We know we need to convert it to a PDF. The long-standing oral tradition is print to PDF. Print to PDF gives you a text-based file, but you strip away the headings, you strip away the list, you strip away the alternative text. All that stuff goes away. And I kind of just alluded to it. Any version of Office that you're in, look for your file save as to do the PDF conversion. How many of you have Acrobat Pro loaded on your machines? Show of hands. Handful, maybe plus. If you have Acrobat Pro, then you have a tab up at the top of Word and PowerPoint both that's labeled Acrobat. If you have Acrobat Pro on your machine, this will be there. And select the Create PDF button that's at the left hand of this toolbar, the left-hand side. What this does is it bypasses Microsoft's PDF Creator, and it actually makes a better PDF to make that a shorter story. But if you don't have Acrobat, you're not left completely on your own. Especially in the later versions of Word, Microsoft's converter is pretty good. So to do a file save as, I'm just going to click on the File tab, and I'm going to select Save As, which you may already do. This is where you would normally go to give the file a name. I promise I'm clicking that, and it's staring at me. I'll audio describe it. That's just fine. When your dialog box comes up, down near the bottom you have the place where you type in your file name, and under that is a drop-down that's labeled with something like File Type or Save As Type. That's the location. Oh, click on Desktop. Well, oh, thank you, sorry. I did not sleep at a Holiday Inn last night. So Save As Type, one of the many options is PDF. always, always, always do this instead of print to PDF.
Can you repeat that question again or comment?
Oh, I'm sorry. Yes, she just pointed out where this is, that I needed to make another selection to get this dialog box up. Thank you. So I have Save as Type. I select PDF. And this piece is, again, this is in Microsoft Office. So Microsoft is going to handle the conversion. If you're on 2010, this is another really good reason to kind of rush that upgrade. One of the things that Office 2010's PDF converter did is that it took all of the images in the PDF and it made it so that a reader would read the alt text for every image first and then get to the text content. Every new generation of Office gets better with this conversion. Even if you're in 2010, File Save As is still better than printing to a PDF. But as you move to the newer versions, this gets much better. If you do a bunch of work where you start in Office and end in PDF, I strongly suggest trying to get a license or getting a license for Acrobat Pro. It's going to let you do some more stuff in the PDF if you need to, and the converter is still a little bit ahead of what Office's does. But I select Save as Type PDF and I click on Save, and it will create a PDF that will carry out the heading structure that I put in, carry the alt text out. It'll manage the reading order well in later versions. In other words, at about 2013, Microsoft fixed that funny little bug where all the alt text was at the top of the reading order for screen readers, which made it very disorienting. And that's the last thing. And this is true again in PowerPoint. If you're saving your PowerPoints as PDF, make sure you do a file save as, not a print to, because otherwise you lose all that stuff if you print to PDF. What questions have I left you with? I appreciate everybody who pointed out obvious things to me. Thank you for pointing them out. I appreciate Google for trying to help. Yes, a question in the back.
So I use a screen reader
Okay.
on my laptop in my office, VoiceOver on my phone.
Yeah.
Thank you for pointing out all of these obstacles that I have to face, usually every 10 minutes in my workday.
Yeah.
It's super important what you've just taught us. Thanks.
Well, you're welcome. And, you know, like with the OCR thing, I don't want to take wind out of anybody's sails with OCR, but I did hear that come up, and I kind of felt compelled to say that, and I'll reiterate it, or reiterate it, OCR isn't accessible. It just isn't. You have the text, but not the structure, which kind of gives someone like you who uses a screen reader regularly the unique opportunity to use a divining rod to figure out how this document is structured, what the visuals mean, et cetera, et cetera. And there's no real effective way to triangulate that. So I have a colleague in Oklahoma who is a lawyer, and she's talked about how she'll use VoiceOver because she has access to VoiceOver as well as JAWS and NVDA, and she will use those three to try to triangulate software in particular, because some of them might better report things than others, or some might guess and guess right to make up for inaccessible software. That to me is just mind-blowingly ludicrous that anybody should have to do that. There aren't really fully automatic solutions to creating accessible stuff. It's up to everybody who makes stuff to make it accessible to the extent that you can from the start. If you have Office 2010, you can't do anything about its unique approach to saving as a PDF, right? That's out of your hands. You could ideally get a copy of Acrobat Pro and go in and fix, but there are limitations. We just need to do everything that we can. Yes?
Clarification,
Yeah.
OCR, do you mean Office of Civil Rights or Optical
Very
Character
good.
Recognition?
Optical character recognition, as was discussed earlier in the afternoon. Yeah. So the apps that, like KNFB Reader, and I don't remember which one Diana showed in particular, that takes a picture, converts it into a PDF, you got the text. But any images that are in there, meaning's not conveyed. There's no structure to it. It's just the text. Arguably could work in a pinch. Arguably. You could also lose that argument. But yeah, thank you. Other questions? Do you feel better, or who feels better about accessibility now than they did when we started? Who feels worse about accessibility now than when we started? Worse? Tired? That's fair. Well, I ask because sometimes people start to think about all the PDFs on their website and freak out. And that's understandable, and I don't think I can kind of push that reaction off, but I can say that start with what you now know, start with what you control, and maybe bring the conversation up within your agency, your entity, about tools. If you're still on 2010, if you can accelerate that upgrade, things like that can make a huge difference. Yes, ma'am.
So then would you say maybe avoid publisher?
Like a plague.
Like for example, like with a newsletter, just because of the different text boxes and...
It's really not a matter of the text boxes and such. It's that publisher, frankly, seems like the redheaded stepchild in the Office suite. And Office has not... I offended somebody with red hair. So publisher just doesn't have good support from the authoring side to build accessibility in, and it also doesn't do a very good job when it spits it out to a PDF. So I hate to say it, because Word isn't really a design tool, and InDesign is InDesign, but InDesign does a much better job than Publisher does. So if you're really doing design, it is. You can look at, there was another tool that somebody who literally writes books on accessibility in InDesign recommended. It's not coming to my brain right now. But Publisher, the other side of this is you can create a PDF in Publisher. You just really have to go into Acrobat Pro and fix it.
What would you suggest using instead of Publisher?
InDesign for print design work. There's not, InDesign. Yeah, it's an Adobe product. It's in the Adobe Creative Cloud. It's a lot bigger than Publisher. It does a lot more, and it is expensive. However, if you're doing a lot of real design work, if you want to streamline the accessibility piece, I can almost guarantee it's going to be worth the investment, because otherwise you're fixing a whole bunch of stuff in Acrobat Pro, which isn't as efficient as being able to design it up front. Yes?
It's really interesting because in DHS we use Publisher to do fact sheets.
Right.
And so that's agency-wide. It's especially important in public and community health.
Mm-hmm.
So really good lesson learned in terms of making these documents accessible.
Right, and it's just, I'm not going to say you can't eventually end up with an accessible PDF when you start in Publisher. You just get to do a lot more. You have a unique opportunity to learn accessibility in Acrobat Pro, which is probably helpful anyway, but you get to really get under the hood, or someone does. And depending on the content, InDesign may not be the best. There are other design tools that might do a good job. But if you're talking about stuff that commonly people use Publisher for, InDesign is going to be, once you learn it, which is another thing too, once you learn InDesign, it's much easier to have an accessible PDF right out of it. Now who feels worse? Oh, don't tell me I can't use, especially if it's across the agency. That's a bigger conversation, I'm sure. Okay, if anyone wants to keep listening to me, I can keep going for another day. So if you do have other questions, if you're around, either right here immediately after, flying out of Oklahoma City, we don't literally have horse and buggies anymore, but sometimes I feel like it is unusually difficult to get places in the country. So I'm going to be around this evening if people are going to be here as well. I welcome your questions. Let me see. Hop back over into the slides. You have my contact. Feel free to reach out, rgcar@okstate.edu, if you have other questions, if things pop into your mind. More than happy to help out however I can. I really appreciate everybody staying who could. I assume the folks who left, I don't know, maybe they did hate it, and I apologize for that. But people have to leave, and I understand that. Thank you all for your attention, your questions, your input. I really do appreciate it. And I'm done with you. I don't know, Lisa, if you have anything else.